Welcome to Dates with Death, the Paris Institute for Critical Thinking's podcast series dedicated to death and all that comes with it. For a long time, the topic of death has been considered as taboo in the West, even almost completely banished from our lives. This has come at a price, so we take it upon ourselves to re-inaugurate the quintessential philosophical task, at least according to Cicero, namely to meditate upon death. In today's date, it is my great honor to be accompanied by Professor Charles W. King. Charles is professor of Roman history, late antiquity, and social and religious history at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Hello, Charles, and welcome.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak in this forum.
It's a great pleasure of mine. Now, as has become the habit here at Dates with Death, I would like to start by asking you the basic question of why death? Why, when, and how did you become interested in this peculiar object of Roman death and afterlife, as this is what we are going to talk about?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think that Roman death brought together for me several different interests, both in terms of subject matter and in terms of sort of methodology. And I'd always been interested in one of the things that had maybe attracted me to the study of history in the first place was an interest in sort of variations within categories. That is to say that, when you throw out a term like family or marriage or life or death, that has a set of associations within our own societies that it's easy to start to believe as universal of every society. And one of the interesting things, of course, is to realize that it might not be, and that there might be cultures that are reading something like death very differently than, say, modern America, modern France, and so forth. And I got interested in death specifically in part simply because of where I was studying in the early days of my graduate program. So I went on ultimately to get a PhD from the University of Chicago, but before that, I got an MA from the University of Arizona, where I was studying with Alan Bernstein, who's written several books on the subject of the Christian hell, the formation of hell, and then later hell and its rivals. And he taught a class, on the history of hell, which, it was about variations of the idea of hell within Christianity in particular, but it also looked at comparative material from Greek and Roman paganism, from Zoroastrianism, from Norse, early medieval Norse thought, and I became interested in this idea of variations of approaches to the afterlife. And then when I went on to the University of Chicago, I was looking for a dissertation topic, and I considered several different ones. But I kept coming back to this idea of Roman death, that I thought that it was something that had not been very well studied, that there wasn't a lot on it. And a lot of what had been written by Franz Kumo or somebody before World War II, and so that it was a field sort of ripe for study, and I've been sort of studying it off and on for the last 25 years or something like that. My recent book in 2020 coming out, and I think that so I was interested in looking at death as an variation of how Roman death differed from Christian understandings or later understandings in other cultures, and I was interested. I think I was attracted to the methodology that was required. That if you study Christian theology, you can sort of pick an author, Cyril of Alexandria or somebody, and you can spend the rest of your career examining, his sizable writings on various subjects, and it's this in-depth dive into a particular text or set of texts by a particular author. And when you study Roman paganism, you really can't do that. I mean, there are texts to look at, but that you don't get theology as such, and philosophy is often sort of detached, at least to a degree, from Roman religious practice, and so you need to sort of collect little bits of information from different sources and put them together, and it's kind of an exercise in model building. Martin Bernal, the historian, once said that what ancient historians do is competitive plausibility. That is, you're putting together a model to explain the existing evidence, which is competing with other models. And so you have to have competitive plausibility. You have to be more plausible as an explanation of the sources you have. And Bernal, of course, is a controversial figure, but for various reasons. But I always thought he was right about that is what ancient historians do. And I found that was an attractive way of approaching a project, that it was interesting to build that model and to see what I could find, if I tried to put the pieces together. And so that's really very much how I got involved in doing Roman death the way I ended up finally doing it. And it's, gone through various stages over the years before my final book, but that it's been a developing model.
It's a very competitive model, if I can tell you that already. It convinced me, at least, but maybe I'm not the typical scholar of that. But again, it's a very competitive model. Now, turning to ancient Rome and remaining obviously aware of the century-long history of Rome, we are in fact talking about more than a millennium, and remaining also aware of the almost innumerable theories that have been proposed about Roman beliefs, is it possible to highlight some of the more basic points about Roman concepts of death and the afterlife? And maybe for now, let us stick with the more traditional narratives, after which we can slowly start correcting and getting into the more competitive and the more convincing narrative or model.
Yes. So traditionally, the way scholars have looked at the Roman afterlife has been based primarily on two main assumptions. One is that afterlife in general, as a category, is similar for the Romans or indeed Greeks, as it is in the Judeo-Christian tradition. That is to say that the focus should be on where the dead go, to an afterlife, to an underworld, and what happens to them there. And so you'll get scenarios that involve some sort of posthumous judgment, and you'll get others that don't. But it's about storage, in a sense. I mean, it's about where the dead go, rather than the interaction of the dead with the living. And the other assumption, which is very closely tied to that one, is that Roman religion is primarily based on Greek religion, even to the degree that what's interesting about Roman religion is always going to come in some way from the Greeks. And this has led, in particular, when combined with the first assumption, a strong tendency to emphasize Roman borrowing of Greek underworld models, which of course show up in Roman poetry and in Virgil's Aeneid and other works. And you have, the divided underworld, and Tartarus, the place of punishment, and Elysium, the place of reward. And it's not necessarily that the Romans had no interest in these ideas. I can think of texts where authors seem to be taking the idea of posthumous judgment seriously. And you have sort of Mainander Rhetor offering, that the dead will go to Elysium. He's giving advice on how to write a speech of consolation to deliver at a funeral. And he's talking about how you need to talk about the dead going to Elysium and so forth. And it seems to me that that would be meaningless if nobody believed in it. So it's not that there's nothing to that. But what my work has shown, I think, is that what that focus on Tartarus and Elysium neglects is, in the first place, the indigenous Roman tradition of the deified dead and deification in general as an approach to an afterlife. And you will normally find that, to the degree that modern scholars acknowledge the Romans had an idea of deifying the dead, that they will restrict it to emperors alone, to the deified emperors, who are sort of a special category. I mean, I once had, when I tried to publish an article several years back, I had an anonymous reader, tell me that, what the author doesn't seem to understand is that deification was limited solely to emperors. And, he sort of made it sound like I was an idiot for not acknowledging this point. But I think that this is not, in fact, correct. And that you need to look at the deification of dead, in particular, the cult of the dead, the worship of the daimones. And daimones, I mean, it's not that they've been entirely neglected, but they tend to be sort of treated as marginal and unimportant. And so that they were only worshipped in collective groups. And in particular, that they were only, that rituals delivered to the dead were only to keep them in their graves. That is to say that that the purpose of rituals involving the manes was to keep the manes away from the living, because you didn't want to interact with them. And I think that this, as my book tries to argue at great length, is not correct, and that this whole idea of deification and of interaction, human interaction with the dead, needs to be reconsidered, and so that's what I've been trying to do.
Yes, and in fact, my next question goes back to that. So we have the traditional model, and then and that's also why I'm so happy to talk to you, because you're one of the people who are actually trying to question, and convincingly trying to question, this antique model. And like you said in your book, The Ancient Roman Afterlife, the Manes Belief and the Cult of the Dead, I think this torpedoes quite a lot of the ancient traditions. Can you maybe say something more specifically about the cult of the dead and about the daimones? Because you say it's not just a negative thing as was generally understood. It's mainly a very positive thing. Can you say something more about that?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So the Romans deified their dead. And they'll be worshipped as gods. And you can find this, in fact, on most any tombstone of the imperial era, at least Latin tombstones, where you'll say Dies Monibus, for the daimones, at the top of the tombstone. And this is so common that I think people have sort of trained themselves not to see it. And you'll find it mysteriously translated in ways that eliminate the word D, which is either, I mean, it's the contracted plural of either Deus, divine, the adjective, or Deus, the noun God. So the manes gods, or the divine manes, whichever you prefer, and it's not actually clear which it is. But clearly there's a use of deistic terminology there, which is very, very clear. And when you see it's translated simply as like spirits of the dead or something, that kind of misses the point. That they do worship the dead, and that the Romans, at a Roman funeral, one of the things that happens is that they, will consecrate the grave as a ritual space for future worship, and they'll give an offering, traditionally a sacrifice of an animal, to the dead person that's being buried there after being cremated in the early empire. And then that there will be ongoing worship thereafter, that you have festivals, the Parentalia, 9 days in February, but there's other occasions you can simply take offerings to the grave. There are home shrines within the house, which can in some cases be located in, like Pompeii, places where you have good preservation of buildings. And so you're directing these rites to the dead. And Ovid says specifically, when he's talking about the Parentalia, you make an offering and then you add prayers, right? You're praying to the dead for them to help you. So you're not just trying to keep them away from you. If anything, you're trying to attract them. And there's a poem by Statius where he's talking about a home shrine, and a man is worshiping his dead father, and he says, I'm summoning your Montes to my house, right? He wants to interact with them. And what are they praying for? Well, so the Montes have a handful of main powers that they have the power of life and death. So you can ask them to extend life or to shorten it in other people. And in the shorten it in other people, there are, for example, military applications where there's a ritual when the Romans are going to destroy a city and not just capture it, where they basically offer the inhabitants of the city to the Montes as an offering, a kind of sacrifice. But then the Montes have to help the Romans win the battle, so the dead have to provide their own offering. In effect, it's a very cleverly worded prayer, I always thought. So you get things like that. But I think that for most Romans, the significance of the Montes would be to keep you alive. That is to say that they have the power to extend life beyond what's initially decreed by the fates. And so that you would pray to them for them to keep you alive longer than you would otherwise live. And if you think about the implications of that, you're thinking about a world in which people are walking through their lives surrounded by the dead. The dead are watching over them. The dead are protecting them from this or that danger that could come up. And because that requires the dead to be, observing them, there are also things that you can call upon the dead to do that involve them watching you. And so you can have, for example, you can call them as a witness for an oath, with the idea that they would enforce the oath if the person swearing the oath breaks it. And they're not the only God that you can call upon to do that. But if you're talking about a God that has the power of life and death, that's, you don't want to piss them off. There is this ability for them to do that. And there's also prayers in multiple places. Statius's Sylvae is a good place to find several examples where people are praying for interaction with the dead in the form of messages and dreams. And psychologists, study reactions to death, point out that people dreaming about dead relatives is very, very common. So the dream itself is sort of a human universal, but here it's being interpreted in a particular cultural context in Rome, where this is a message from the Montes and they, whatever they do in their dream, you can then interpret as a message to you about something you should be doing in your life, with the implication that the manes can see not only your current life, but also your future, and therefore can advise you. And so, I mean, the dead can watch over you. And the call of the manes can be combined with the idea of there being some sort of underworld in which some type of judgment and favorable or unfavorable placement can take place. And you will find that the manes are invoked as having some control over that process. So you can have, there's a passage in Suetonius where at the death of the Emperor Tiberius, they call out to the manes to give him no place in the underworld except among the impious, right? It suggests there's a pious versus impious division. And that can be phrased in terms of, Greek models of Tartarus and Elysium. So you can bring those in and combine them. And you'll see that in like Virgil's Aeneid, where the hero Aeneas worships his dead father as one of the manes in book 5, and then he goes and visits him in Elysium in book 6. So you can bring these models together, but my argument is that it is the manes that is the dominant tradition. That is the religious ritual implications of, what are you doing when people die? It's all about the manes. It's about initiating ceremonies with the manes and continuing those ceremonies later. And even on the tombstones, you don't have to put anything about the afterlife on a tombstone, but they do, right? They put Dis Manibus at the top. They don't say, may you go to Elysium, which is actually very, very rare to find on a tombstone. And so you have the dead watching over you while you're alive, and they can, if you choose to invoke this sort of idea of a segregated afterlife, you can invoke the manes to help you get the more favorable placement in that scenario. And so the manes can work together with these other traditions. But what I think is a mistake is to focus on like Tartarus and Elysium to the exclusion of the manes. And in particular, scholars that have done that often say, well, they don't seem to be that committed to the idea of Tartarus and Elysium, so they must not have an afterlife at all. And you'll find relatively recent books arguing that the Romans had a mostly secular view of death. And I just think that that's completely misleading. And that death was very important to them, and they thought the dead were with them, the dead were watching over them, and so this is it's a model of the afterlife that not only is based on what the dead can do for you in the world of the living, rather than storing the dead somewhere, but it's also a model in which the boundary line between human and God is porous, and you can cross that line at death, and you can become one of the manes. And
in a very democratic way also, because you insisted before that it's not just for the emperors, it's everybody who could.
That's right. And if you look at the criteria for, essentially determining who worships whom, it's based on, in part, it's based on inheritance. So if you inherit anything from anybody, you can end up being obligated to worship. It depends on there's like a formula in the pontifical rules that has to do with the percentage of the estate that you end up getting, whether that obligates you. But so you can be obligated on the basis of inheritance, but you can also be obligated on the basis of family loyalty. Broadly speaking, Pietas, it's a term that the Romans used to talk about obligations in family, in government, but also obligations between humans and gods, as being reciprocal. So the myth to explain the idea of pietas that the Romans tell is that once upon a time there was this woman who was sentenced to death by starvation, but she was allowed to have visitors, and she didn't die. And eventually they realized that her daughter has been breastfeeding her, just as the mother had once breastfed the daughter. And this shows you the idea of Pietas. It's about ongoing reciprocal obligations that everybody owes loyalty of certain kinds to every member of their family, and it can be extended beyond the family to include friends and even like political figures that you admire in certain cases, and that this can then be expressed by the cult of the dead. So that to die and not have worshipers would require you basically not just to not leave any property and inheritance to somebody, but also to not have any close family relatives of any kind, even if they're not linked by property. And so that it is a very democratic, a very inclusive form of deification, that it really is everybody. I mean, you do have deified emperors, and they are a special category, and they get, I mean, basically the difference is that a deified emperor gets public worship by priests as an individual, whereas the Montes, they get worship as an individual by their surviving family members. But when Roman priests worship Montes, they worship them in groups, like the military ritual that I talked about. And so there's an implication that a deified emperor is somehow a slightly different and more important form of God than an ordinary one of the Montes. But it's not entirely a different idea. And I think that the way people have tried to limit deification to just emperors is you really have to disregard a substantial amount of evidence to come to that conclusion, and I think it's not acceptable as an argument.
No, and I think you make an excellent point there. But the Manes is, well, not the Manes. Like you said, that there was also this aspect of death that needed to be kept away. Not all death, obviously. And in fact, in a previous date on the Greek afterlife, a previous date with death that I have with Professor Sarah Iles Johnston, we spoke a bit about the Greek restless dead. And it wouldn't be correct, I think, to not talk also about the Roman similar restless dead. In fact, because also for the Romans, like you already said, the border between life and death was extremely porous. And the Romans too believed in the possibility of these dangerous revenants, be they returning ones or be they simply brought along by incantations. And also for the Romans, it was insanity or madness, if not death itself, as the definite and the real threat of these dangerous ghosts. Death was, and the dead were considered as unclean. And that's also why they were buried outside of the city. As long as it was outside, they were kept there, and it was good. So can you say something about these more dangerous dead? Maybe also, if you think that something here ought to change in this understanding of ours as well.
Well, I mean, I like Sarah Iles Johnston's work, and I like, even though there's some substantial differences, I think, between like the Greek cult of the dead that she's looking at in the Romans. But I mean, I like her focus on interaction between the living and the dead in various different sorts of scenarios. And for her too, it's not always negative. And for the Romans, there are different categories of dead in effect, and different types of interaction that you can have with them. And I always try to emphasize that if you're talking about the Manes, the Manes of the family and so forth, well, it's in theory it's possible to anger them with neglect and have them be angry at you in the way that you could do with any other god, and that that this is primarily, dead that you're trying to invoke, that you're trying to get their power to work for you. But then there's other situations in which the dead can be directed in a way that could be, contrary to your interests, or even directed as a weapon against you.
Mm.
And the Romans talk about, in addition to the Montes, they have the larvae. And, what are larvae? Well, if you look at the different references to it, the larvae appear to be dead that have no pre-existing ritual relationship with the particular humans that they're interacting with. And they are not recognizable. Whereas you have a story in a Roman source, where, someone encounters one of the Montes, they always recognize it's their father from whatever. And in the stories about larvae, they're always unrecognizable. They have either a sort of super white skeletal appearance, or sometimes they're described as being extremely dark in color in some way that renders them impossible to recognize, so that they're dead that you wouldn't know, and you wouldn't have, you wouldn't be able to ward them off by having this ongoing, relationship of worship, inside your house or something with them, so that they could be threatening to you. And the larvae, they show up in different contexts. They're not necessarily evil. They're simply, they can be directed to apply vengeance from different forces, and this can include the gods. So in scenarios where you do have like punishment after death, you can have the larvae brought in to punish the death in the underworld, which might be a force of justice, and therefore, again, it doesn't show that larvae are intrinsically evil. But larvae also seem to be at times dead that are invoked by sorcerers to attack people. And then that would be a particularly disturbing sort of possibility, in that you would be threatened by the dead, who, and you don't know which dead it is. You don't have any connection with that dead that would allow you to ward it off, or have a pre-existing favorable relationship with it. And so that could be very threatening. And one of the things that they can do, as you mentioned, is madness. You could be, larvatus is the word that shows up in Plautus's plays, driven insane by the larvae. That's, Plautus is 2nd century BC, but you can find it in the 2nd century AD too, in Apuleius's Metamorphosis. So you have this idea of the dead that can kill people, that can drive them insane, but they're doing it as, in the service of somebody else's desire for vengeance against you. So this would be a threat. And one of the things I point out in my book is that the traditions about the Lemuria, which is a festival for the dead in May, you'll get variations in terms of how Romans refer to the dead that show up, because it's a ritual where the dead come to your house and you will give them an offering of beans. And some authors, notably Ovid, will present them as being sort of an extension of the Montes and the cult of the dead, that's also practiced at the Parentalia. But you'll also get other sources that suggest that the Lemuria, is the dead of the Lemuria, are more hostile, and in some cases they specifically use the term larvae, which suggests that some Romans viewed it as a ceremony, in effect, to attract potentially hostile dead as some kind of preemptive action, where you'd give them an offering, and then you could then establish contact with dead that you wouldn't ordinarily do so. So you can kind of see this tradition of larvae as being sort of at the margins of the larger tradition about the Montes as a variant. But I mean, it's one that seems to be recognized as a threat connected to the broader threat of sorcery in general, which the Romans largely defined as the invocation of powers to harm somebody else, right? So the magic in general isn't illegal, but using magic to harm people is. And so the larvae, their powers can then be invoked for exactly that kind of work.
Okay, thank you. Now, almost 40 years ago, Paul Venn wrote one of his classical books on whether the Greeks really believe their myths. Not only is that question still valid for the Greeks, it is probably even more important when talking about Roman religion and Roman beliefs. Did they actually believe in everything that in the Elysian field or in the Manes? Did they truly believe in the dangerous reverence? Did they truly think that their dead lived on as gods, as the? And if I may immediately add a different take on this question too, can one maybe say that this question is even more important not because of the beliefs of the Greeks and the Romans, but because of our incapacity to look at the past without our modern Christian bias?
Well, yes. So I like that you brought up Paul Venn. Because Venn has this very sophisticated book about do the Greeks believe in their myths, and then when he turns to the Romans, he says these enormously broad, condescending things. So I quote a passage in my book where he says the Romans believe nothing about the afterlife, and it seemed to me that was. Well, again, it has to do with the way certain scholars prefer everything Greek to everything Roman. But there's a broader issue, which is that there's been a tendency in recent work on religious thought within the sphere of Roman studies about the Romans specifically, but also in anthropology, having to do with people scattered over a wide area, China, Madagascar, and other places, to deny that the concept of belief is applicable to any non-Christian culture, and to insist that belief is intrinsically Christian. And this, I think, is not an acceptable formulation, because if you look at how the argument is constructed, it normally defines belief in a very narrow Christianized way that has to do with Christian creedal formulas. That is to say, sets of mandatory beliefs to define group identity. I believe, Jesus is Lord, therefore I am a Christian. That kind of thing, where you have some sort of mechanism to enforce the correctness of beliefs, and therefore that there would be only one set of correct beliefs. And so people, they say, well, you see all this diversity in the Romans, in some of these other societies mentioned by the anthropologists, so that can't be belief, that has to be something else. And then, to my mind, they struggle to find a good explanation of what it is then. But I think that in the first place, that if you simply look the word belief up in a dictionary in English, but I think this is also true of other, modern European languages, the equivalent terminology, that belief is just not that narrow. The dictionary would say that belief is to have confidence in the truth of an assertion, and to say that only Christians could do that just seems very strange. And so when you have these broad definitions of belief, I don't think that you can say that this could be restricted to Christianity or to any really, or to any particular time period or anything like that, that it just doesn't work. But having said that, I think that there are differences in the way beliefs can be applied, and that to say that that the problem with the arguments against belief are the way they equate belief in general with a particular sort of creedal formulation of belief within Christianity. And if you look at what the Romans are doing, the Romans, they have no mechanism that enforces correctness of beliefs. That the priests, they're concerned with ritual and things like that, but I mean, they're not telling you what to believe beyond the very general points, like the gods exist. So you have a situation in which beliefs can just coexist. And I became interested in this, so I'll tell you the story. I became interested in this issue when I was working on my dissertation. I was trying to deal with the problems of how to talk about a situation in which you have no definition of correct beliefs. So you have various beliefs distributed through a community, but that through community interaction, some of these beliefs would be more common than others. And I was trying to figure out how to talk about that. And I was using the word, the English word consensus to mean that. And Ian Morris, who studies ancient, he studies death in relation mostly to early Greek archaeology. He was a member of my dissertation committee at one time, so I got into an argument about it, and he insisted the consensus meant that everybody endorsed a particular position, and that therefore had to be, an assertion of correct beliefs. And I was saying, well, no, that's not what I mean. And so we got into an argument about it, and I told him that I thought talking to him was like talking to a wall, because he wasn't listening to anything that I was saying. So he got angry and resigned from my dissertation committee. So if there are graduate students listening to this, let me just say that you probably shouldn't say something like that to one of your professors, even if it's true, which it was. So anyway, so I had to reform my committee a little bit after that. But having raised this issue, that I then had to find a solution to it. And what I ended up doing was looking at set theory of how to define categories by means of sort of overlapping variables. So in biology, I have what's called a polythetic set. And it's a set made up of the overlap of categories. So you'll have a number of examples in your set that don't all have the same features, but there's a degree of overlap which would allow you to define a category by that overlap. And a good example would be like a bird, right? An eagle and a penguin are both birds, but they don't look the same, right? They have all these different features, but if you sort of break it down the way biologists do, they would say there's enough overlap there that you could include them in the same category as parrots or some other type of word. So I was looking at these kinds of overlaps of sets, and in particular, a model of the fuzzy set, which comes from psychology. People like Eleanor Rosch talking about the percentage of people that might have a particular idea. And so a fuzzy set would be it would be a polythetic set is made up of the overlap of other sets, but it wouldn't be that every possible variable was equally weighted, that some of them would be more common than others. And it seemed to me that that fit what I was talking about very well, which was the idea that you have a society in which they're not asserting sets of correct beliefs that you have to endorse, but there are these beliefs in the community, and through community interaction and the fact that some of them are reinforced by rituals and some of them might not be, and so forth, that you're going to get some of them as being more common than others. So you can talk about degrees of endorsement of particular beliefs without defining some beliefs as correct and some as incorrect. And so what I was arguing in my book to do is that you'd be looking at something like, I use the term belief clusters, where you would have, some beliefs depend on an endorsement of some underlying belief. So you get variations that all depend on agreement on some other point. So that other point has to be more common, and you can kind of set up a hierarchy of the occurrence of beliefs. So something like the idea that, for example, the dead of the Lemuria, some people see them as as Montes, some people see them as larvae. So those are variations, but they're all dependent on the idea that the dead exist as this force that's mobile and can come to your house, and you can interact with them there. So there are these points they agree on, and then there are the variations that are built upon those points. And so that's what I mean by a belief cluster, that you can find ideas often grouped around like some central point, either a very general belief, God X exists, or some like ritual action or something that reinforces a particular detail about that God. But then you can have, from that common ground, other variations that might be individually less common. And that this maybe is a better way of looking at it than trying to define, the Romans believe X, Y, and Z, and then saying, that this is like set in stone or something, that you always have to say that, well, they believe X, but X maybe has these different sub-beliefs that are different from each other, and that you have a group of beliefs that are related, rather than, defining doctrine, and again, in the Christian creedal sense,
and orthodoxy.
Orthodoxy, yes.
And I think this also takes me really close to my next and unfortunately last question, is that you stress in your work a very important aspect that and that's what you call the orthopraxis. And that's an idea that should be studied a lot more, and maybe even especially in our contemporary Western societies, where orthodoxies and Inquisition seem to be again on the rise. Anyway, I too was taught a long time ago that the Roman religion was all about do ut des, about a strictly functional give so you can be given back. But your insistence on this idea of orthopraxis and not on the orthodoxies sets the practices of Roman belief in a completely different light, and also their beliefs sets it in a completely different light that takes it far beyond the mere give and be given back. Can you say something more about this in conclusion, please?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So again, I was looking at different models from the study of other cultures that might help me in looking at what the Romans are doing, and I became very interested in a model of orthopraxy that was put forth by James Watson and Evelyn Roski in separate articles, but they're in the same like anthology, and they're looking at orthopraxy in China, and they're arguing that instead of doing what, say, Christianity does, which is to define group activity by define group activity by correctness of belief. So, you believe X, Y, and Z, and therefore you're a Christian in good standing. That the Romans are defining group identity by the correct performance of rituals. And so that Roman priests, they are experts on ritual procedure, but they don't really get into disagreements about the nature of deities. That they get into disagreements about how to worship them, and what the correct ceremony is, and jurisdictional issues of which priest has jurisdiction over that ceremony, and so that's the kind of thing Romans argue about in religion. But they don't really argue about beliefs of how to define the gods. And so what Roski in particular is saying is that this means that doesn't remove the issue of belief from what the Chinese she was talking about, but as I'm applying it to the Romans are doing. What it does is it limits the number of beliefs that are being officially endorsed to a minimum. That is to say, if you're saying that the gods want such and such a ceremony to be performed in such and such a way, you're endorsing the idea that the gods exist, that they can respond to prayers, and that they want this and that ceremony. But anything else that you want to believe about them is up to you, right? So it's not that beliefs aren't important to individual participants, but that they're not being officially asserted as a way of defining the religious identity of the group. And you really have only sort of very general beliefs that are built into the performance of ceremonies. And if you look at it that way, and then you can see how a very broad range of variation can coexist, and they can perform the same ceremonies. So the people that thought the Lemuria was about the Montes, and the people that thought the Lemuria was about the larvae, they can both perform the Lemuria ceremony, right? The dead come to your house and you offer them beans, and so that the ceremony can become sort of the focal point at a center of a cluster of variations in belief. And it's not that the beliefs aren't important, but that they're not being officially asserted by the priests. So it's up to the individual believers, and variations can simply coexist. And the idea, the specific example you mentioned, the I give and so that you may give, that belief, it could be built in to the performance of a ceremony, right? You're performing the ceremony to honor the god with the hope that God will help you. So it's not that it couldn't be part of that. It's just that the definition of the group religiously is not about belief in any particular point, right? It's about the collective performance of ceremonies, within a range of procedures that are being defined by Rome's religious officials, and even private ceremonies like parentalia for the dead, where individual people are going out to do this for their own relatives. There are still official procedures for how to perform the ceremony. And you assume that there's probably a lot of variation that we don't hear about in practice. But in question, there is at least an official procedure. But what you want to believe about the Montes, other than they exist and that they can answer prayers, it's up to you. That's fair.
Well, thank you so much for this, Charles. Thanks for this extremely illuminating talk. I would have loved to continue talking to you, especially about your idea that the afterlife was not a major factor in conversion to Christianity. I think that seems extremely provocating as well, but maybe we will be able to do that another time. So anyway, thanks a lot for this lovely talk.
All right. Well, thank you for having me here.
It's been a great pleasure. Thanks also to our listeners for having joined us in this episode of Dates with Death. And dear listeners, if you like our volunteer work at PICT, you can now also consider supporting us by becoming an active member of our institution. For more information about how to join PICT, please visit our website. My name is Kristof Vanhoutte. Thank you and